Welcome, sugar babies, to Neo Sugar Rush. I'm Emery Leanne Miller, your pastry chef, Food Network champion, and guide to all things sweet. Before we get started, be sure to like and subscribe for more delicious content coming your way. Today, we're going to be making my Vermouth Noir shortbread frites. So these are shortbread cookies that I made for season 15 of Food Network's Halloween Wars when I was challenged to combine chocolate with olives. This is not a recipe you're going to find anywhere else. You can click the link down below and you can download a printout of the recipe. There is one for the shortbread cookie itself as well as the ganache. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get started. Prior to zesting our lemon, I do like to roll it on my tabletop and squish it down a bit. This just makes it a lot faster and easier to zest your lemon. And then I'm just going to quickly zest this and then move on to the next ingredient. Anytime there's zest in my recipe, I like to rub it with sugar at the very beginning before I add any other ingredients. And this is because rubbing the sugar with that zest will help to release some of the essential oil in the zest. So I'm just picking this up and I'm just rubbing it with the sugar, and you can just smell that burst of lemon. After that, I'm going to be adding my flour straight to the bowl, and then I'm going to be adding my salt. You really don't need that much salt because the olives are going to be adding quite a bit of a saltiness to your cookies already, but just a little bit of salt here, and then we can move on. Normally, I like to sift my dry ingredients and use a KitchenAid, but on this recipe, I just find skipping those is totally fine. So I'm just going to be placing that off to the side, and then we're going to be moving on to our rosemary. So for 2.5 teaspoons of rosemary, that's going to be about 3 medium sprigs. So I'm just going to be taking these and I'm just going the opposite direction of the direction that the leaves are growing. And I'm just going to be pulling on this branch and just detaching it from that woody branch in the middle. And then once I do that with all 3 of these, we're going to chop it up. Once we have our finely chopped rosemary, I'm just going to be dumping this right into our bowl, pushing that aside again, and then we're going to be taking our butter. So this says 115 grams. You can just grab one whole stick like this, which is about 113, but close enough. So you do want your butter to be cold to get that shortbread nice and crumbly and flaky type of cookie. Now that our butter is chopped, I'm just going to pull this bowl back towards me, and I like to wear gloves for anything like this, but I'm just going to lightly mix all of my dry ingredients together, and then I'm going to take all of my cubed butter. So you can see I chopped it into kind of small cubes here. It'll just make mixing it together a little bit quicker and easier if you do cut it into these smaller cubes, because we're going to be rubbing this dry mixture together. And we actually want about pea-sized little pebbles forming in our dry ingredients. So I'm just breaking this up into those cubes I chopped before I place them in here. From here, I'm going to pick up my butter and dry ingredients, and I'm going to rub them together between my hands. I'm going to be careful not to do this too much because I do have really hot hands, and we want that butter to stay cold. If I were to do this too much, I would bring all that butter to room temperature. You don't want that. So I'm just taking any large pieces of butter, breaking it up a little bit more, making sure they're not too large of chunks. And then again, just picking it up and rubbing it with all that flour. So some of these pieces are still too big, but some of these are in like a nice little piece-sized form like this one. I've been a pastry chef and sugar artist on 6 TV shows now. And I normally like to overcomplicate my recipes. I like to add a lot of layers and make it really interesting and try to stand out. But on this one, I found that just doing this simple shortbread cookie was a huge hit with the judges, and just dipping it in ganache was a nice little finishing touch at the end. And it helped to free up more time on the show. So on this specific episode, it was the sugar spotlight. So I had to do a lot of sugar work throughout the whole episode. I really didn't have that much time to focus on the pastry work, so I'm glad that I stuck to a more simple recipe than what I normally do. You can easily make this recipe in about an hour, and that's with allowing it to chill in the fridge for a while. This recipe does call for 100 milliliters of heavy cream. You might have to add a little bit more, but start with that 100 milliliters, and then you can always add a couple splashes as you're bringing the dough together if you find that it's a little bit too dry. Okay, from here I'm just going to be using a spatula to start mixing this together because again, I have really hot hands, and if you do too, you don't want to be melting that butter in the process. So I'm just avoiding touching the butter as much as possible at this point. The olive shortbread recipe that I use as inspiration for this Halloween Wars recipe that we're using today originally called for black olives. Now, I hate olives so much. I hate them with a fiery, burning passion of hell. And I personally don't know the difference between all the different olives, but I decided to take a chance by instead of using black olives, I use vermouth soaked olives. So they're Spanish Queen Martini olives. So we can see how dry and crumbly this mixture is. But if we start to mush it together with our hands, it should start to form a dough. So I'm just going to add a touch more heavy cream just because this is still a bit on the dry side, but we don't want to overdo it with the heavy cream. Now that our dough is fully formed, I'm just going to pull out my plastic wrap and we're going to wrap this up and we're going to chill it in the fridge for about 30 minutes. I'm actually going to section this off into 2 pieces. This is just going to make it easier to roll out later. And I'm not squishing down my dough too much. I still want it a little bit thick because after we've chilled this, we're going to roll it out to the thickness that we desire. So we don't want it too thin. We just want a nice fat disc that we're going to wrap up and put in the fridge. Here we are. See you in 30. Now that our dough has had time to chill, we're going to roll it out to the desired thickness. And the amount of cookies you're going to get out of this will depend on the thickness of your cookie as well as the size and shape that you cut it into. Now is also a good time to preheat your oven. I'm going to be using my wooden rolling pin, but you can really use any rolling pin that you have on hand. And instead of using flour on my table to keep my dough from sticking, because it is a little bit on the sticky side, I'm actually going to leave it in the plastic wrap. And that way I don't incorporate more flour and dryness into the shortbread, which is already kind of a dry, crumbly cookie. So we're just going to leave it like this. I'm just going to unwrap one layer here and I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure and just gently roll this out to the thickness that I desire. If you want your shortbread to be in a rectangle shape, then as you roll this out, you can also kind of squish the edges back in so that your dough is not in a round shape and you can get more rectangle cuts out of your dough. And this is about a ½ inch thick. I'm going to keep this on the thicker side because I do want this to stay together. Shortbread can be really crumbly, and so if you roll it out too thin, it's just going to break way too easily, especially when we go through the process of dipping it in ganache. You don't want your cookies to break on you. So I'm going to keep this about ½ inch thick, and then I'm going to pull back this plastic. And from here, I'm going to use my ruler and a pizza cutter to get nice sharp edges on my cookies. If you find that your dough is too hard to cut, you might want to pop it back in the fridge or even the freezer for a little bit so that that butter can solidify. Or you can even use a very light dusting of flour to make it easier to cut into shape. My dough's been out for a little while, so it is getting a little bit hard to cut, but I'm going to go ahead and move forward. If you want to be super precise, you can use the measurements on your ruler to get exact cuts on your cookie. I do find that this shortbread tends to spread quite a bit when you bake it. So even if you are precise in this step, it tends to get a little bit disformed in the baking process. So I wouldn't stress about this too much. I'm just going to eyeball this and I'm going to make my cookies about 3 inches long and about maybe just under an inch wide. From here, I'm going to use a cookie sheet with a Silpat mat on it. You can also use parchment paper if that's all you have on hand. And I'm just going to very gently peel back these cookies and try to keep them in the shape that they're at. And I'm just going to very gently place them on my cookie sheet. Once you have all of these cut shortbread cookies ready to go on your mat, you can take your leftover dough and just very gently push it back together. And we're going to use our rolling pin to roll it back out to that same thickness that we had before. Try your best to do the same thickness of cookie every time you re-roll this, because if you have various thicknesses, they're going to bake differently. So unless they're on different trays, I just highly recommend that you try to keep them the same thickness. So I just rolled this back out. Now I could continue to cut this shape, or you could do a shape like this. So you could just take a regular round cookie cutter and do round cookies as well. If you're wondering why I cut my shortbread into thin strips like this, it's because I originally made this recipe for Halloween Wars. And when you're on that show as a pastry chef, you have to make tasting elements that blend into your display that is made up of pumpkin, cake, and sugar. So for this display, it was a bar scene, and I wanted to have bar food or what looked like fries. So I wanted these to look like French fries, and I put them on a plate that was made of sugar. So that's why I did this shape specifically. But again, you're welcome to do any shape or size that you want. So you can do it in these thin strips, or you could also do it in a typical round cookie shape. I'm going to pop this in the freezer for at least 10 minutes before I bake it for about 18 minutes. So the time that you bake it for is going to vary depending on the thickness of your cookie, how many cookies you have on your tray, as well as your altitude. There's just so many variables there. I live at a very high altitude. I'm using a regular home oven. I don't have my convection setting turned on. And so for me, it's going to take about 18 minutes for these cookies to turn golden brown. But you're going to want to bake at around 18 minutes and then start checking it periodically every couple minutes until you see them start to turn golden brown. This last step is optional if you're feeling bold enough to add a dark chocolate ganache coating to your shortbread. But this unusual pairing of dark chocolate and olives really impressed the judges on Halloween Wars. They said it was funky, but in a good way. Now, when you download the recipe for the shortbread, you will also get the Vermouth dark chocolate ganache. So this is a really good recipe that you can just swap out that liquid for a different type of liquid. Typically, when you make a ganache, you have your dark chocolate, heavy cream, and maybe some butter added to it. And you just melt those together so that you get a pipeable, spreadable consistency. But in this recipe, you swap out the heavy cream for a different liquid, such as the vermouth, or you can do a fruit juice. And then you still need a fat in this recipe in order to blend those ingredients together. And that is why this recipe calls for butter. The fat in your butter is going to replace the fat that you typically would get from the heavy cream so that it can all blend together with your chocolate. This recipe is pretty easy to follow. You just put most of those ingredients that it calls for into a pot, and then you heat it to 70 degrees Celsius. And then you place that over your chocolate to melt the chocolate down, blend it all together. You just want to be careful to monitor the heat and not bring it above 70 degrees Celsius. If you overheat your liquid and place it over your chocolate, it is going to make your ganache grainy and not be silky smooth. When I originally created this recipe on the set of Halloween Wars, the only vermouth that they had on set that I had access to was red. So if you want this to be closer to an actual martini drink, then I would recommend going with a dry option. I'm just giving you the recipes exactly how I created them on the set of Halloween Wars. Now, with that being said, I've actually never had alcohol before, and so it was extremely out of my comfort zone to incorporate the vermouth into my tasting element, and we don't really do alcohol in my house. So I am choosing not to add any vermouth into my ganache at this time, so I'm just going to be doing a 1-to-2 ratio of dark chocolate with heavy cream. And I know it's very typical to put your heavy cream into a pot and heat it over the stovetop, then pour it over your chocolate. I'm also not going to be doing that because I feel like it can very easily spill over if you overheat your heavy cream, and you can also very easily overheat your chocolate. So I just like to do it in a small container like this. I'm also going to add a touch of butter here. I'm not measuring that out, just adding a little bit of extra fat here. And then I'm just going to slowly heat this in the microwave until I can blend the chocolate together with the heavy cream and get my ganache. I only did a small amount of ganache, but this only took me about 30 seconds in the microwave. Now we're going to dip our finished shortbread into the ganache. Your recipe will make more than what I have here. I just wanted to make a very small amount so that there is no waste. And I just wanted to point out real quick, if you have butter chunks that are larger than pea size, then you're going to get these huge pits in your shortbread, and it's going to be a little bit less visually appealing. So just make sure that you are cutting up those butter chunks into much smaller pieces so you don't get these huge pits. And a reminder that because this dough is so delicate, it does tend to get a little bit warped in the baking process. So you can see that my cookies are not super uniform. When you pull these out of the oven, you can try and shape them up as they're still cooling down. I personally love the colors that are peeking through the shortbread, so I don't want to dip the entire cookie in chocolate, plus it can get a little bit messy. So I just like to dip one half. I'm going to be a little bit more focused on the top half of that cookie, and I'm just going to make sure it's a nice even dip. And then I'm just going to shake off a little bit of the excess and also scrape it off the side of my bowl here, and just make sure I don't have too much extra ganache. And then I'm just going to place this on parchment paper here, And what I like to do on this, it's already a pretty salty shortbread because of the olives that are in there. So you don't need a lot here, but I just wanted to sprinkle a little bit of flaky sea salt on this, which gives it a nice kind of briny, salty touch to it. If you find that your chocolate is getting too thick, you can always reheat it in very small increments. Again, you do not want to overheat your chocolate here. And I personally only like to do a few cookies at a time and then sprinkle my sea salt. If you wait too long, then the chocolate will start to set and your sea salt is just going to bounce right off. I also typically get the sea salt that is in larger crystal forms. So I tend to have to kind of crush it up with my fingers as I'm sprinkling it over the cookies. And when I originally made this, I chose to go with the ganache so I didn't have to temper chocolate. But if you're feeling a little bit extra, I actually think it would be pretty fun to temper some dark chocolate and dip these cookies in a nice, clean, crisp shell. But if you want that vermouth incorporated into the chocolate and not just into the olives, then the ganache is the right way to go. Thank you so much for joining me today on learning how to make my Vermouth Noir shortbread frites that I created for season 15 of Halloween Wars. Again, you can check out the 2 recipes that we use in this video today by checking out my website down below. Be sure to like and subscribe for more delicious content coming your way. Let me know if you like this combo of chocolate with olives, and until next time, good luck and happy baking.